For anyone who is new here, my name is Annie. I am a dog trainer and I am currently training to become a canine behaviorist. If you want, you can let me know what breed of dog you have, or whatever behavior struggle you may be dealing with. You could just put it in the chat if you feel like it. So today we're going to talk about what's actually happening inside of your dog's brain when they struggle with things like reactivity, overexcitement, frustration, anxiety, impulse control, and many other common training challenges. But before we begin, I want to briefly explain my approach to training. So I use what is called concept dog training. It's quite different from traditional dog training. Traditional dog training often focuses on suppressing behaviors and obedience. So, concept dog training focuses on developing the skills that shape behavior, learning, and decision making. So, we are basically rewiring our dog's brains. Concepts are emotional and cognitive skills that influence how dogs think, how they learn, how they process information, and how they respond to the world around them. We build these skills through training games, lifestyle choices, and rescue strategies. So we use those when things don't go according to plan. What I love about concept training is that it focuses on how dogs actually learn, and how their brains actually function. So, because we want to understand what's happening in the brain, behavior starts to actually make more sense. All right, I see someone wrote in the chat, German Shepherd, Siberian Husky, impulse control, coming to me, and reactivity. Yeah, it sounds like you're dealing with a lot of genetic behaviors, Julie. And we're going to actually be talking about a few things today that can help with that. So I am going to share my screen with you guys. All right. So there are two important parts of the brain that I want you to understand. First is the amygdala. So the amygdala is often called the emotional center, or threat detection system. Its job is to constantly scan the environment and ask, is it safe? Do I need to pay attention? Could this be dangerous? The amygdala is really fast. It's emotional. It's reactive. Its job is not to be logical. Its job is to keep your dog alive. So it's based on survival instinct. The second area is the prefrontal cortex. So this is the thinking part of the brain. This is the area involved with impulse control, decision making, emotional regulation, problem solving, and learning. So this part of the brain, we want our dogs using as often as possible. When dogs have access to their prefrontal cortex, they can think before they act, and they can process information, they can make better choices, and they can learn. A good example of this is fireworks. So first we'll look at a dog that is afraid of fireworks. So the firework goes off and the brain asks itself, am I aware of it? So obviously, yes, they see it, they hear it. Then the second question they ask is it important? So they're going to answer yes to this if they are fearful of fireworks. And then the final question is it good or is it bad? So this is where the amygdala steps in. The amygdala decides that this loud, unexpected noise might be dangerous. So the emotional brain begins taking control, and the dog becomes more alert, more reactive, more emotional. And now, if we were to compare that to a dog who is comfortable with fireworks, the dog notices the sound, they are aware of it, but they quickly decide it isn't important. So the brain doesn't continue processing it as a threat. The dog returns to a calm state, and the thinking brain remains available. So this is why two dogs can experience the exact same event and have completely different responses. All right. So when our dogs are overwhelmed, they struggle to listen, to make good choices, and to learn. So this is where so many behavior problems actually begin. As emotional arousal increases, the amygdala becomes more influential. The thinking brain becomes less available. The amygdala has taken over and they no longer access the prefrontal cortex. So impulse control decreases, frustration of tolerance decreases, decision making decreases, the ability to respond to cues decreases. This is why dogs often appear to be ignoring us. This isn't refusal. The issue is that the brain is struggling to process information effectively in that moment. So your dog knows the cue. They may perform that cue perfectly at home, but when emotions become overwhelming, access to those skills decreases. This is why understanding the emotional state is so important. So next we're going to talk about the nervous system. So obviously the brain doesn't work alone. It works together with the nervous system. So there are two branches I want you to know about, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is associated with activation. So this is a system preparing the body for action. So heart rate increases, alertness increases, the body prepares to respond. The parasympathetic nervous system is associated with recovery and regulation. So this is a system responsible for rest, calmness, and recovery. So when dogs are calm, parasympathetic activity is higher. When dogs become highly aroused, sympathetic activity starts increasing. Neither system is bad. Dogs need both, but the goal is balance. Okay, so when we talk about arousal, we're talking about mental activation. So simply how activated the brain and body are. Low arousal makes thinking easier. Moderate arousal can be a great learning zone for our dogs, and very high arousal makes thinking difficult. So as arousal increases, emotions become stronger, thinking becomes harder. This is why so many behavior challenges are actually arousal challenges. So there are three concepts or skills that I work on with almost every dog, no matter what behavior challenge they're dealing with. And they are dimmer switch, thinking and arousal, and calmness. So a dimmer switch means dogs can access more than just on or off. So they don't have that light switch behavior where they go from 0 to 100. They don't have access to any of those other arousal levels in between, right? When they have that light switch behavior. So we want dogs to learn that they can gradually increase and decrease their arousal levels and be able to access those different levels of arousal rather than just on and off. So thinking and arousal means that dogs can still process information when emotions are elevated. So they can still think, they can still make choices, they can still access their skills. And calmness is exactly what it sounds like. It's the ability to settle, to recover, to regulate themselves. Together, these skills help dogs maintain access to their thinking brain, so that prefrontal cortex. So when we're working with all three concepts or skills, you are making sure that your dog's brain is using that prefrontal cortex. All right, so thinking in arousal. So one of the biggest mistakes we make is avoiding high arousal situations. with our dogs. The problem is that dogs then only experience high arousal when real life throws it at them. So when that happens, they're expected to perform skills that they've never actually practiced. Thinking in arousal is a really important skill for every dog, no matter what problem they're dealing with. It can be developed. Dogs can learn to think when they're excited. They can learn to think when they're frustrated. They can learn to think when they're challenged. This is where our training games become so powerful. We're building the skills before the real world situations happen. So when life gets difficult, the dog can already access the thinking part of their brain. So I'm going to show you an example of a training game that I use for thinking and arousal. All right.
All right, so we're going to be playing Mouse Game. This is a really good arousal up, arousal down game. It's good for tolerance of frustration, impulse control, and even disengagement. So you're just going to start with some of your dog's food. Depending on how food motivated your dog is, you could use a low value food or a high value food. Also, depending on how much you want to bring up their arousal level. So if you really want to increase their arousal level and make it really difficult for them, you could use a high value food. But for Brio, we're just going to use her regular food because any food brings up her arousal levels. So we're just going to start by caging a piece of food in our hand. And Brio's played this game a lot, so she knows the drill. But when you do this, if your dog is pawing or hitting your hand with their nose trying to get the food, once they stop doing that behavior, you will release a piece of food to them. So we're going to cage the food. Oh, that was my fault. Good girl. You can make it even more difficult. You can cage the food and you can take your hand away and see she's really controlling herself. Okay, good girl. Gonna cage the food. So when she starts moving away, that is showing that she has good impulse control. She's working on her tolerance of frustration. Good girl. And when she looks away from the food and looks up at me, that is showing disengagement. So she's disengaging from the food and engaging with me. So we're going to reward her for that. And she's real twitchy. She's moving a lot, but she's still working. Let's see if she can disengage from the food. She's very intense. Good girl. All right, and then if you want to use it as an arousal down tool, we can just get Brio moving and cage the food. See, so we had her arousal up, and now she has brought her arousal levels down. Good job. Super girl.
All right, so we'll go back to our slides. Okay, so now we are going to take it one step deeper and we're going to talk about neurochemicals. So everything we've talked about so far isn't just happening at the level of behavior. There are actual chemical changes happening inside of the brain. So these chemicals influence how our dogs feel, how they think, how they learn, and how they respond to the world around them. When dogs are in a calm, regulated state, they have access to their prefrontal cortex, and certain neurochemicals become more influential. So one of these is serotonin. Serotonin helps support impulse control, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking. This is one of the reasons calm dogs often make better choices. Another important chemical is oxytocin. So it's associated with feelings of safety, trust, connection, and bonding. This is one of the reasons relationships matter so much in training. We also see increased activity from GABA, so that helps calm activity in the nervous system. You can think of it as one of the brain's natural braking systems. It helps to prevent the brain from becoming overactivated. So we're going to compare it now to a dog who is becoming overwhelmed. So as arousal increases, different neurochemicals become more influential. Noradrenaline increases. So this increases alertness, vigilance, scanning the environment, and readiness to respond. The dog becomes more focused on what is happening around them. So if the situation continues to feel important or threatening, cortisol is released. Cortisol helps to mobilize energy and prepare the body to deal with challenges. This is useful in genuine emergencies. The problem is that when cortisol remains elevated, learning and emotional regulation become more difficult. And depending on the situation, dopamine may also increase. Dopamine is not a bad thing. It's dopamine is essential for motivation, engagement, and reward seeking. But dopamine is also part of what can drive intense pursuit behaviors. So things like chasing, fixating, frantic greetings, and obsessive focus. So this is why excitement can sometimes look very similar to stress. The emotional state may be different, but the brain and the body are still highly activated. The important thing to understand is that one of these chemicals isn't good or bad. They all serve important functions. Again, the goal is balance. So problems arise when the system becomes overwhelmed and one part of the system begins dominating the others. When that happens, emotional reactions become bigger, recovery becomes slower, and access to the thinking brain becomes more difficult. All right. So one of the most important things to understand in that high arousal does not always mean the same thing emotionally. High arousal can come from negative emotions such as fear, anxiety, or uncertainty, but it can also come from positive emotions such as excitement, anticipation, or frustration around something the dog wants. On the outside, these emotional states can look very similar. In both situations, we might see barking, lunging, pulling, inability to focus, increased movement, or difficulty responding to cues. This is why behavior alone doesn't always tell us what the dog is feeling. We need to understand what is driving the behavior. So when arousal is driven by fear or a perceived threat, the brain begins prioritizing survival. So the amygdala becomes highly active. The dog's attention narrows. Their focus shifts towards identifying danger and staying safe. However, when a dog remains in this state, learning becomes much more difficult. The brain begins storing information through the lens of threat and danger. So instead of learning that something is safe, the dog is more likely to remember that it felt scary. This is one reason fearful behaviors can become stronger over time if dogs repeatedly experience situations that overwhelm them. All right, so we're going to look at excitement next. Excitement-based arousal is often driven by dopamine and reward-seeking systems within the brain. So the dog sees something they want. Maybe it's another dog or a squirrel or a person they want to greet or even a toy. The brain becomes highly motivated to move towards that thing. The dog feels energized, focused, driven. Sometimes this looks happy and enthusiastic, but excitement can become problematic when arousal rises too high. So the dog becomes less thoughtful and more impulsive. The thinking brain becomes less available. Decision making starts to deteriorate, and the dog may struggle to disengage from what they want. So, one of the most important things to understand is that excitement can quickly turn into frustration. They are going from a positive to a negative state. So you can imagine if a dog, say, sees a cat. At first, they may be excited. They want to chase, they want to access the cat. But because they're on a leash, they can't get what they want. So the desired outcome is blocked. Now frustration enters the picture. The dog may begin barking, lunging, whining, pulling harder on the leash. The behavior may suddenly look much more intense. So, what started as excitement has now turned into frustration. This is why so many dogs appear to change emotional states so quickly. In reality, many dogs are not experiencing pure excitement or pure fear. It's often a mixture of emotions. So the reward system may still be highly active. So the dog still wants something, but stress chemistry is also increasing. This creates a hybrid emotional state. These dogs often look tense, hypervigilant, reactive, and unable to settle. This is why overexcited dogs can sometimes look very similar to anxious dogs. It also explains why emotional states can change so quickly. So, a good example of this would be when two dogs are playing. So, they can appear to be having a wonderful time, everything seems fine, and then suddenly conflict occurs. People will often describe this as kind of happening out of nowhere, but it rarely comes out of nowhere. Both dogs are already in a highly aroused emotional state. Because arousal was already high, it only takes a small change for emotions to shift. So one dog may stiffen slightly, they may hesitate, one dog might move away. To us, these signals may seem very minor, but to the dogs, they can completely change the emotional meaning of the interaction. So the excited emotional state suddenly becomes uncomfortable for them, and then the emotional interpretation changes. So because the dogs are already highly aroused, they do not have access to low intensity responses. This discomfort is expressed with the same intensity as excitement. So this is why interactions can escalate so quickly. So whether arousal comes from fear or excitement, the result is often the same. As arousal rises, access to the thinking brain decreases, decision making becomes more difficult, learning becomes more difficult, impulse control becomes more difficult. This is why so much of concept training focuses on arousal regulation. So our goal is not to eliminate emotions. Our goal is to help dogs stay in a state where they can still think, learn, and make good choices, even when emotions are present. All right, so the reason training games work is because the brain learns what it rehearses. So every repetition strengthens a pathway in the brain. So if a dog repeatedly rehearses frustration, they're going to become better at frustration. If they repeatedly rehearse over arousal, they're going to become better at over arousal. But if they repeatedly rehearse thinking, disengagement, calmness, recovery, and making good decisions, those pathways are going to become stronger too. So that's why concept training focuses so heavily on the training games. We're not just teaching behaviors, we're changing what the brain becomes efficient at doing. All right, so now that we've talked about the brain, the nervous system, and arousal, let's talk about something practical that can influence all of those systems, and that is enrichment. So we hear the word enrichment all the time in the dog world, right? Most people think of enrichment as simply giving their dogs something fun to do, or to prevent unwanted behaviors or to encourage their natural behaviors. But enrichment is actually much more powerful than that. Enrichment doesn't just occupy our dogs, it can actually influence how they think and how they feel, and it can influence how they interpret the world around them. One of my favorite examples comes from a research study that was done on rats. Now, whenever I mention rat studies, people sometimes wonder what that has to do with dogs. The reason these studies are important because many of the fundamental brain systems we're talking about today function very similarly across mammals. So I'm sure you've heard of these like neurochemicals and stuff for our own brains, right? So the for this study, um, the researchers used two groups of rats. So the first group of rat was tickled every day, and the second group was not. Both groups were then presented with new objects in their environments. The rats that experienced the regular positive interactions, so the tickling, were much more optimistic when encountering new items. So they were curious, they approached the object more readily, they explored, they were willing to investigate. The rats that did not have those same positive experiences were much more cautious. So they hesitated. They were more likely to avoid the objects. They appeared less optimistic about what these new things might mean. The difference was the emotional state the animal brought into the experience. So the positive experiences changed how they interpreted the world. And this is incredibly relevant to dogs. Every experience our dogs have is helping shape how they view future experiences. So when dogs repeatedly experience positive, rewarding, enriching activities, they begin developing a more optimistic outlook. They're more likely to approach novelty with curiosity rather than suspicion. And they're going to be more likely to investigate before automatically assuming that something is dangerous. So they're going to be using that prefrontal cortex rather than the amygdala just taking over and assuming everything is dangerous. So they're more likely to stay connected to their thinking brain. Going back to what we discussed earlier, when dogs encounter something new, the brain is constantly asking, is it important? Is it good or is it bad? So dogs who have a history of positive experiences are more likely to give the situation the benefit of the doubt. The emotional brain is less likely to immediately jump to the conclusion that something is threatening. This is one of the reasons why enrichment matters so much. Enrichment isn't just entertainment, it's brain training. So it's helping shape how our dogs process information and respond to the world around them. This is why I encourage my clients to start their day with happiness. So before the day has a chance to become stressful or overwhelming, we can give our dogs opportunities to experience success, curiosity, and positive engagement. So this doesn't have to be complicated. It could be something as simple as scatter feeding their breakfast in the grass. It could be a food puzzle, a snuffle mat, a treat ball, a simple search game. These activities engage the brain, they encourage problem solving, and they create positive emotional experiences. So over time, all of these small experiences add up. They influence how the dog approaches challenges. They influence emotional resilience. They influence confidence. And they help create a brain that is more likely to stay curious, thoughtful, and engaged rather than immediately defaulting to fear or overwhelm. So at the end of the day, we're not trying to create perfect dogs. We're trying to create dogs that can think, dogs that can learn, dogs that can recover from challenges, dogs that can make better choices. when we understand what is actually happening in the brain, behavior becomes a lot easier to understand. And when we stop focusing solely on behavior and start building the skills underneath behavior, real change becomes possible. All right. So if you wanted to learn more about concept dog training or more about behavior, you can book a free consultation with me, or you can join my free Facebook group. You can ask questions there. You can connect with other dog owners, and we will be having live discussions there as well. You can find both of those on my website, healingdogs.ca. And I have a gift for everyone who attended today. This is the number one game that I teach every dog, no matter what behavior struggle they're dealing with. It is such a strong game to help work on so many different concepts, and it's called Boundary Games. And I am going to give you access to the full training video that I send to all of my training clients. And you can get that video at games.healingdogs.ca. So you can take a picture of that or a screenshot of that, and you will get access to the video instantly.